Dismissive avoidants can experience love in a very different way from what most people expect. There is often a particular condition that makes them lower their defenses, reconnect with their emotions, and begin moving towards someone instead of away from them. But here is the important part. Understanding that condition does not mean you should try to manipulate it. In this video, we're going to explore what can cause a dismissive avoidant to finally become emotionally invested, why distance can sometimes intensify their feelings, and most importantly, how you can respond without abandoning your own needs in the process. The first thing we need to understand is the pattern I often describe as feelings minus fears. A dismissive avoidant can have genuine feelings for someone while simultaneously carrying deep fears about emotional closeness. These two forces can exist at the same time. A major reason for this can be childhood emotional neglect. And emotional neglect isn't always obvious. A child can grow up in a stable home, have food, clothing, education, structure, and everything they physically need, while still missing something incredibly important: emotional connection. Maybe emotions weren't openly discussed. Maybe vulnerability was uncomfortable. Maybe crying was criticized or dismissed. Perhaps the child was told to toughen up, stop being sensitive, or simply learned that showing strong emotions made their parent uncomfortable. Over time, the child begins forming a powerful internal conclusion. This emotional side of me isn't safe to show. So instead of learning how to express feelings, ask for comfort, or depend on someone emotionally, they learn to suppress those needs. They become skilled at functioning independently, because independence feels safer than needing something that might not be available. Now think about romantic relationships. Connection isn't just one thing. There are several dimensions involved: intellectual connection, physical closeness, sexuality, and emotional intimacy. A dismissive avoidant may feel perfectly comfortable with the intellectual side of a relationship. They can talk, laugh, exchange ideas, and enjoy someone's company without feeling excessively exposed. Friendships can therefore feel much easier. There is usually less pressure to reveal deep emotional vulnerability, and there is more freedom to control personal space. Romantic relationships are different. Eventually, emotional intimacy becomes part of the equation. You have to reveal more of yourself. You have to depend on someone sometimes. You have to allow yourself to be seen. And for someone whose early experiences taught them that emotional dependence is dangerous, that closeness can activate old fears. This is where the feelings minus fears cycle becomes important. As emotional attachment grows, feelings can become stronger, but the fears can grow alongside them. The subconscious mind works heavily through associations. If someone's earliest experiences with vulnerability were connected to disappointment, rejection, shame, or emotional unavailability, their nervous system can carry those associations forward. Their conscious mind may understand that their current partner is completely different from their parents or caregivers, but the deeper emotional system doesn't always make that distinction immediately. It may simply recognize, "I'm becoming vulnerable again," and vulnerability can trigger the old alarm. This is why a dismissive avoidant may sometimes appear conflicted. They can genuinely care about someone while simultaneously feeling an urge to create distance. At a certain point, the feelings and fears can become equally powerful. The person may feel pulled toward the relationship and away from it at the same time. That internal conflict can lead to behaviors that look confusing from the outside: withdrawal, emotional shutdown, mixed signals, or even pushing away someone they genuinely care about. But something interesting often happens when distance enters the picture. When the emotional pressure decreases, the fears can become quieter. The person isn't constantly confronted with vulnerability. Their nervous system has more room to settle. And once that fear decreases, their actual feelings may become much easier for them to recognize. So sometimes, paradoxically, distance allows the feelings to become louder. But there's another important piece to this. Many dismissive avoidants learn hyper-independence as a way of coping with childhood experiences. They discover that if they don't need anything from anyone, they don't have to experience the pain of having those needs ignored. Think about the logic behind that adaptation. If needing someone hurts because the person isn't emotionally available, then eventually the safest solution seems to be, I don't need anyone. And when they convince themselves of that, they experience relief. That relief becomes reinforcing. They begin identifying as someone who needs freedom, personal space, autonomy, and plenty of time alone. They may genuinely believe that this is simply their personality, and in many ways, it is a survival strategy that became deeply familiar. So when someone enters their life and respects that independence rather than immediately trying to eliminate it, something important can happen. Imagine communicating. I understand that your independence matters to you. I don't want to take that away, but I also have needs, and I want us to find a way to respect both of them. That creates a completely different dynamic. The dismissive avoidant doesn't feel trapped, but they also don't feel abandoned. They can experience acceptance without having to surrender their autonomy. And when there is enough emotional space, something else can develop. Longing. Sometimes a dismissive avoidant needs room to actually notice someone's absence. When the constant intensity disappears, they may begin realizing how much that person means to them. But there is one more layer that is especially important. The needs that were often missing in childhood weren't necessarily freedom or independence. Those may actually have been the things they learned to create for themselves. What may have been missing was being understood, acknowledged, emotionally recognized, and accepted. So, when an adult partner provides those experiences in a healthy way, it can touch an extremely deep emotional place. Being listened to without judgment, having emotions taken seriously, feeling understood instead of criticized, being able to make mistakes without immediately feeling defective, experiencing empathy instead of shame. These experiences can become incredibly powerful for someone who spent years believing that their emotional needs were unacceptable. This can help explain why a dismissive avoidant may sometimes become intensely attached to someone who makes them feel genuinely seen. It isn't about finding a secret trick to make someone fall in love. It is about understanding what emotional experiences may have been missing and recognizing how meaningful those experiences can become later in life. And if you're the partner or loved one of a dismissive avoidant, there is one warning you absolutely need to remember. Understanding their needs does not mean sacrificing your own. If you constantly accommodate them while ignoring yourself, resentment will eventually build. You may become frustrated. You may start feeling unseen. You may become critical without realizing where that criticism is coming from. That doesn't create security. Healthy relationships require both people to matter. So yes, acknowledge their need for independence, respect their desire for personal space, understand that emotional closeness may sometimes feel overwhelming to them, but also say, I understand that these are your needs, these are mine. How can we meet somewhere in the middle? That conversation is essential. Maybe one person wants to spend time together once a week, while the other wants 4 days. The answer doesn't have to be one extreme or the other. Perhaps you find a middle ground. Maybe you prioritize meaningful quality time instead of simply increasing the number of hours together. Maybe you balance in-person time with calls or other forms of connection. The goal isn't to determine whose needs are correct. The goal is to learn how to build a relationship where both people can be heard. That is what creates security. That is what allows two people to understand each other without losing themselves. And that is ultimately much healthier than trying to become exactly what a dismissive avoidant wants in order to keep them close. If you've experienced this dynamic yourself, think about what happens when there is a little more space. Do the feelings become clearer? Does the longing increase? Or does the distance simply make you feel more disconnected? There is no single answer for everyone, but understanding the pattern can help you respond with much more awareness instead of reacting from fear. And if you want to learn more about these dynamics, stay connected with Avoidant, because there is much more to unpack about what happens beneath the surface when someone who fears intimacy begins developing genuine emotional attachment. There is an important distinction we need to make before going any further. When a dismissive avoidant starts missing someone after distance appears, it does not automatically mean that the relationship has suddenly become healthy or that all of their fears have disappeared. It simply means that the emotional pressure may have changed enough for feelings that were previously buried beneath fear to become easier to recognize. This is why the behavior of a dismissive avoidant can sometimes seem so contradictory. When you're close, they may pull away. When you stop chasing, they may become curious. When you give them room, they may start thinking about you more. And when you finally stop trying to convince them to connect, they may suddenly realize how much emotional significance the relationship actually carries. That can be incredibly confusing for the person on the other side. You might think, why did they seem so distant when I was right there, but now that I'm giving them space, they're suddenly interested again? The answer can be found in the interaction between attachment and fear. For someone with a dismissive avoidant pattern, emotional closeness can activate a sense of vulnerability. When the relationship becomes intense, their protective system may interpret that closeness as pressure. The problem isn't necessarily the person. Sometimes the problem is what closeness represents. Being close can mean being needed. Being needed can mean having responsibility for another person's emotions. Being emotionally open can mean risking rejection. Depending on someone can mean giving them the ability to hurt you. So the closer the relationship becomes, the more those internal associations can become activated. But when the pressure decreases, the nervous system can settle. And once the internal alarm becomes quieter, there is more room for the person to experience the positive side of attachment. They can remember the conversations. They can think about the moments that felt safe. They can notice how comfortable they were around you. They may start remembering small things they previously overlooked. They may realize that your presence had become part of their emotional routine, and suddenly, your absence becomes noticeable. This is where longing can emerge. But longing isn't the same thing as readiness. That distinction matters enormously. Someone can miss you and still be afraid of intimacy. Someone can love you and still struggle to communicate. Someone can think about you constantly and still not know how to build a stable relationship. Feelings alone don't automatically produce secure behavior. This is why you should never interpret someone's renewed interest as proof that you have to abandon your boundaries and immediately give them everything they want. Instead, look at what they actually do with those feelings. Do they communicate more openly? Do they take responsibility for their behavior? Do they show consistency? Are they willing to discuss problems instead of disappearing? Are they making room for your needs as well as their own? Those behaviors matter much more than temporary intensity. A common mistake people make in these relationships is assuming that if they can just become more understanding, more patient, more available, or more accommodating, the dismissive avoidant will finally feel safe enough to stay. But there is a serious problem with that approach. You can create a safe environment without becoming responsible for someone else's entire emotional development. You can be compassionate without becoming a therapist. You can respect someone's boundaries without allowing your own boundaries to disappear. And you can give someone space without putting your entire life on hold while you wait for them to decide what they want. That balance is essential. Remember, dismissive avoidance often develops around the belief that emotional dependence is dangerous. But the opposite extreme isn't healthy either. A relationship cannot become secure if one person constantly suppresses their needs, so the other person never feels uncomfortable. That isn't security, that's self-abandonment. A healthier approach is to create room for two realities to exist at the same time. You can say, I understand that you need independence, and also, I need consistency in communication. You can say, I don't want to pressure you, and also, I don't want our relationship to disappear whenever emotions become difficult. You can say, I'll respect your space, and also, when you need space, I need you to communicate that instead of leaving me guessing. Those conversations may feel uncomfortable initially, but they create something incredibly valuable: predictability. And predictability is one of the foundations of emotional safety. A dismissive avoidant may be accustomed to relationships where emotional needs were ignored, criticized, or overwhelming. A secure relationship introduces something different. Needs can be discussed, boundaries can be negotiated. Conflict doesn't automatically mean abandonment. Space doesn't automatically mean rejection. Closeness doesn't automatically mean losing yourself. That is the new emotional experience that can gradually challenge old beliefs. And this is why trying to trigger jealousy, disappear intentionally, manipulate someone's emotions, or use silence as a strategy isn't the answer. You don't need to manufacture scarcity. Healthy space is different from manipulation. Healthy space means both people have room to breathe while remaining connected. Manipulative distance is designed to create anxiety and force a reaction. Those are completely different things. If you're dealing with a dismissive avoidant, your goal shouldn't be to figure out the perfect amount of distance that makes them chase you. Your goal should be to understand the relationship well enough to determine whether both people can participate in it in a healthy way. That changes the entire question. Instead of asking, how much space should I give them so they'll miss me? Ask, what kind of space allows both of us to remain emotionally healthy? Instead of, How do I make them fall in love with me? Ask, are their feelings being translated into consistent actions? And instead of, what can I do to prevent them from pulling away? Ask, what do I need in order to feel secure, respected, and valued in this relationship? Those questions put you back in your own center, because the reality is that a dismissive avoidant isn't the only person whose emotional needs matter. You matter too. Your desire for affection matters. Your need for communication matters. Your boundaries matter. Your emotional security matters. And if you constantly silence all of those things because you're afraid that asking for them will make the other person withdraw, eventually the relationship becomes built around fear. That isn't sustainable. Real emotional intimacy requires both people to gradually learn that closeness doesn't have to mean losing autonomy. For the dismissive avoidant, that may mean learning that depending on someone occasionally doesn't make them weak. For their partner, it may mean learning that giving someone space doesn't require abandoning yourself. Both people have something to learn, and that is where genuine growth begins. Sometimes the most powerful shift isn't getting closer. It's creating enough emotional breathing room for both people to recognize what is actually happening inside them. When the fear becomes quieter, the feelings can become clearer. But once those feelings become clear, the next question is far more important. What are you going to do with them? Because recognizing love is one thing. Learning how to express it consistently, communicate through discomfort, respect boundaries, and remain emotionally present is something entirely different. And that is where a relationship moves from simply having strong feelings toward actually building a secure bond. So, if you're involved with a dismissive avoidant, remember this. Distance may reveal feelings, but consistency is what builds trust. A dismissive avoidant may begin missing you once the pressure disappears. They may realize your importance when they have room to think. They may even experience a stronger emotional pull toward you when you're no longer constantly seeking reassurance. But don't confuse that emotional pull with a complete transformation. The real question is what happens afterward. Do they come back and communicate? Do they acknowledge what happened? Do they make an effort to understand your perspective? Do they become more consistent instead of repeating the same cycle of closeness followed by withdrawal? Those are the signs worth paying attention to. And if they need space, let space be healthy rather than turning it into a punishment or a test. You don't need to disappear just to make someone miss you. You don't need to create jealousy. You don't need to withhold affection to make yourself more valuable. Instead, allow both people to have breathing room while maintaining reasonable communication and respect. A secure relationship isn't created by chasing someone until they finally surrender their defenses. It's created when both people learn that they can be close without losing themselves. The dismissive avoidant may need to discover that vulnerability doesn't automatically lead to rejection, and you may need to discover that loving someone doesn't require constantly proving your worth or sacrificing your emotional needs. That's the balance. You can understand their fears without accepting unhealthy behavior. You can respect their independence without becoming emotionally invisible. You can offer compassion while still maintaining boundaries. And you can give someone room without putting your own life on pause. Ultimately, the goal isn't to figure out how to make a dismissive avoidant fall in love. The goal is to understand whether the connection can become mutual, consistent, and emotionally safe. Because love isn't only about what someone feels when you're absent, it's also about what they're willing to do when you're present. So if you've experienced this dynamic, ask yourself a simple question. When the distance disappeared, did the consistency remain? That answer may tell you far more than the intensity of their feelings ever could. If this perspective helped you understand the dynamic differently, stay connected with Avoidant for more conversations about attachment, emotional patterns, and relationships. And remember, understanding someone else's wounds should never require you to abandon your own needs.